please join me in giving Dr. Nelson a warm colonial huzzah as he comes to the podium. Thank you.
I'm going to ask us tonight to tackle a familiar history, right? Everyone in this room probably would raise their hand if I asked, have you heard of the American Revolution? What was the American Revolution about? I think we could mostly answer those questions. So to offer a unique vantage point, I'm going to ask us to shift our geography tonight. We may know quite a bit about American independence and the Revolutionary War, but now I want us to focus westward onto perhaps some less familiar geography of that conflict. In so doing, we get a new way of understanding not just the struggle for sovereignty, independence, and autonomy that played out during the Revolutionary era. We are also able to appreciate the wider ranging ramifications and legacies of that watershed event. I think it's particularly appropriate that I fit into this series that starts with the origins of the American Revolution and goes all the way forward to think about Spanish Texas specifically, indigenous Texas specifically, and those 19th century legacies and echoes of independence that shape Texas going forward, right? Because this is a war and a world event, not just for 13 Anglophone colonies on the eastern seaboard, but for millions of souls across a vast continent. To underline this point, I'd ask you to envision where the American Revolution begins. Was it Lexington Green, perhaps? I was fortunate enough to travel to Boston this fall to do some research. I drugged my family along with me, and I took my little toddlers there and I showed them where the American Revolution started, right? And yet this is only one answer to that question. This is the spot where the shot was heard around the world, but maybe we need to think about other potential candidates, right? Later on that day, we went a little further down the road to Concord. And here is where New England farmers made the fateful decision not to break and run as they had done at Lexington Green, but to march resolute down the Old North Bridge to meet the Redcoats head on, and thus force a victory to begin the war in earnest. Or maybe we could be clever, right? Dig back further into the constitutional crisis that brought about the conflict and independence. Maybe you could say that the actual revolution begins in 1773 with the shockingly expensive act of vandalism that we now call the Boston Tea Party, or in the bloodshed of the Boston Massacre in 1770, or even the beginning of the fight over taxes in 1765 with the Stamp Act protests. But none of these events gets us quite far back enough, and all of them remain relegated to the tidewater politics of the eastern seaboard. So instead, I would push us just a bit earlier in time and a great deal further west. Because my argument tonight is that the origins of the American Revolution can be found in the West. And in so many ways, the Revolutionary War was a war for the fate of that Western world. To get where I am going, we really have to go back to the war that started it all. Not the Revolution, but the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War as we call it here in the U.S. Colonists at the time called it the Great War for Empire, and it truly was a westward-facing war from start to finish as they contemplated expansion across the Appalachian Mountains. It begins, of course, with a scrap over the forks of the Ohio when a young George Washington blunders into that conflict. Washington badly bungles the initial encounter, right? Ends up with a British officer dead after he's been disarmed, and the conflict spirals from there until it morphs into the world war that we might be familiar with between empires. The early years of the war, of course, go badly for Britain as they fight to not just hold on to their colonies, but also try to advance against French Canada and the Ohio country. But then finally, William Pitt takes control of British Parliament. He introduces his so-called American strategy, and that pivots resources and attention to North America. By the end of the war, the British have conquered all of Canada and secured their claims west of the mountains. namely the Ohio country. And this is going to be the key definitive moment for this western march towards what will become revolution. Because while this victory was astonishing, right, this is the famous Benjamin West painting of Wolfe's victory on the Plains of Abraham. This is where the British essentially secure Canada by capturing Quebec. James Wolfe dies, right, as a good martyr to empire, as you see pictured here. But this is also an encapsulation of this expansive American-hued British Empire, right? Not only do you see British redcoats there and elite gentlemen from London, you see Scottish troops, you see Welsh Fusiliers, but you also see Americans, right, playing their role in empire. And that includes both indigenous allies, like the Mohawk man seated in the foreground, and the green-coated ranger, who is meant to stand in for the American troops. And so this is a victory for empire, but it's a victory for a distinctly British-American empire, right? It also is a costly war, not just in casualties. Britain had significantly outspent the French, both at sea and in America, and nearly doubled the national debt by war's end. Not only that, but their new territorial empire was vast and diverse, as pictured here, right? Somehow they had to find new ways to garrison and control expansive stretches of new territory in the eastern half of the continent, while also balancing a budget. This is no easy task. It sets us up for the troubles with taxation going forward, but that's not really our topic for tonight, right? The other challenge is going to be Britain's need to pay off its war debt and govern this continent that now includes not just Anglophone speakers along the coastline, but thousands of native people in the interior that do not see themselves as conquered, and French Catholics in what was French Canada, Quebec, right? Not to mention those mercurial American colonists who think that they deserve their piece of the pie after victory, right? So of course this sets up Britain for an almost impossible task by war's end, 1762 into 1763. This is going to be a challenging cast of characters to rule over for the British state. We get a little bit of this from a quote of the British as they begin to occupy the interior at the end of the war, right? In 1763, for instance, British garrisons disperse across the Great Lakes and Illinois country. They begin to take possession of those old French fortifications there, and they begin to tell indigenous people in all these places that they are now in charge. This is the response that a British trader records from one of these indigenous leaders in Michilimackinac. So if you think of the Great Lakes, it's kind of smack dab in the center. It's at the very top of the Michigan Mitten, if you picture that in your head, right? And Minwewe, sometimes known as the Grand Sauteur, tells Alexander Henry and the British garrison that arrives there, "Although you have conquered the French, you have not yet conquered us. We are not your slaves. These lakes, these woods, these mountains were left us by our ancestors. They are our inheritance, and we will part with them to none." And while this is one individual native leader stating this, right, it is a common sentiment that the British encounter in the Illinois country, in Detroit, in the Pennsylvania back country, even as far south as the Cherokee lands over the mountains. All across indigenous America, the haughty ways that the British approach the West after France's defeat lead to indigenous resistance efforts. In the Carolinas, Cherokees, who had been firm British allies during the 7 Years' War, rise up against the British for the first time ever. The northern Indians, led by Pontiac, follow suit. And this pan-indigenous revolt that plays out from Niagara to the Illinois country to the Carolina back country is short-lived, right? It is inevitably squashed by the British. By 1764, most of the native groups have signed peace treaties with the British, but it signals the amount of unrest to come. The British cannot be sure of indigenous passivity going forward, and as a stopgap solution to avoid future conflicts of this sort, George III himself steps in to issue the Proclamation Line of 1763. And what this does, right, is it draws an imaginary line along the back spine of the Appalachian Mountains. All the lands west of the mountains must for now remain the purview of indigenous groups living there. Settlement, in other words, is forbidden across the mountains except for a very few isolated military garrisons in the Great Lakes, the forks of the Ohio, and in lower Illinois. And this boundary sets up the first major impasse between Westerners and the Crown, right? It's not about taxes, and we're not even to 1765 yet. No one's heard of the Stamp Act, okay? Note that it's 1763, 2 years earlier than the first major protests in the coastal cities. Western squatters and land speculators, people ranging from barely literate folks like Daniel Boone and George Morgan, all the way up to land speculators and rich elite Virginians like George Washington, a young surveyor now, all reject the King's Proclamation Line. In general, they begin to see that perhaps King George is more inclined to favor Native American interests over these American settlers in the backcountry. And so illegal migration into Kentucky will begin during the late 1760s in direct defiance of George's proclamation line. Virginians and Pennsylvanians especially will continue to claim lands in the Ohio country just as they had done in the lead up to the French and Indian War. If we tell the history of the Revolution from the West, so to speak, this is typically the starting point. But it's also about as far west as we go in that origin story. There's an emphasis here on the Ohio country. As an Ohioan, I don't mind that, right? But we get Kentucky, Ohio, the Proclamation Line, as the powder keg of the West, right? So if we've got the Stamp Act and the Tea Act and things like that in the East, the Proclamation Line and eventually the Quebec Act are going to be the things in the West. But there are other actors in this story that we haven't touched on yet, right? And there are other great powers to contend with, even further west. And that is where I want to push our gaze even further tonight, right? So we're not just going from Lexington and Concord into the Ohio country, we're going even beyond that. Because when the 7 Years' War concludes, Spain receives Louisiana through a secret treaty with the French. This is not something the British anticipated or wanted. It's what they get at the end of the war, right? Spain inherits French Louisiana from New Orleans, from New Orleans up to what they call Spanish Illinois. What they really mean is modern-day Missouri. So it's the west bank of the Mississippi River across from Illinois, right? And the Spanish accept this offer from the French for strategic reasons. This is not a particularly wealthy region yet, right? There are some sugar and cotton plantations just beginning in Louisiana, right? But that's not the reason the Spanish want Louisiana from the French. They want it for geopolitical purposes. They need to protect their actual cash cows, which lie in Mexico, right? They want to protect those mines of Zacatecas, the silver industry there, the actual centers of Spanish imperial power. And the theory had always been that Texas served as that buffer zone against the French, right? So the somewhat poor and somewhat troublesome northern colony of Texas serves as a buffer zone while the French are in Louisiana. Now that the French have been knocked out of the game at the end of the 7 Years' War, the Spanish expand what they consider a buffer zone further east into Louisiana and what they call Upper Louisiana or Spanish Illinois, what we would call Missouri today. St. Louis is founded as a Spanish city in the final days of the French and Indian War by French fur traders trying to escape British claims to the Illinois country. Essentially, all the French fur traders that do not want to live under their recent enemy, the British rule, cross the river and set up shop in what will become early St. Louis. So it is a Spanish post essentially populated by ex-French officials, fur traders, etc. And thus, for the first time in history, the Mississippi River becomes the dividing line between empires. And of course, this sovereignty in the interior is not just settled by treaty. It is negotiated, contested, and worked out on the ground by individuals living on both sides of this now international border. The interior then, not just in the Ohio country, not just in Kentucky, but across the region from the Appalachian Mountains into the Mississippi River Valley, becomes this pressure chamber of imperial rivalry as well as settler-indigenous tension. The river then is not just a boundary, it is a borderland, it is a lifeline, and it is a crossing point between these different groups that include Spanish officials, French who have not vacated the region, the British themselves who are trying to gain control over places like Illinois, and the native people that are vying for attention, supplies, gifts, and favors from both European powers, right? And this would include those groups that are more favorable to the British, like the Dakotas, certain groups of the Ojibwe and Ottawa, but also groups that are more inclined towards the Spanish, like the Potawatomis, off and on the Osage, but not really, right? Different groups on both sides, essentially, of the Mississippi River. So Spanish officials strengthen New Orleans, they cultivate these native alliances, and they carefully begin to regulate trade in what they call Spanish Illinois. They police the Mississippi River and pick off British traders that try to cross over and tap into the fur trade of the far western part of Spanish territory. Both the British in Illinois and the Spanish across the river fear encroachment from the other side. They will confiscate pelts from both parties if they are caught in alternative territory. They will sick native groups on one another, and they will try to steal native allies from one another throughout the 1760s into the early 1770s. This is a rivalry between the Spanish crown and the British crown. And you can see that these are both medals that are minted at this time to be distributed to indigenous leaders, right? One, you have George III. The other, you have Carlos III, the two vying monarchs. And many native groups and many native leaders are happy to accept the bribes and the gifts like this, diplomatic gifts, from both parties whenever the need suits them, right? So when they arrive in St. Louis, they're happy to kind of put on a face of alliance with the Spanish, accept the gifts, accept the medals, that sort of thing. Then they'll go back to British Detroit and they'll do the exact same thing again, right? So they're playing the playoff system, as one historian has called it, between European powers. So it's a clever game for these native groups. All of this to say, right, that by the early 1770s, long before the Revolution has actually kicked off, the Mississippi Valley is already an important imperial frontier between the British and the French. The British and the Spanish. British officials begin to encourage loyal migrations of British subjects from the Carolinas into what they call West Florida, but what they really mean kind of the east bank of the Mississippi River across from Louisiana, today's Mississippi. So they set up posts in Natchez and Manchac, and they promised to protect that land and to offer grants to those willing to move there. Spanish officials, in turn, strengthen New Orleans. They cultivate these native alliances from the Illinois country, which you see pictured here, all the way down the Mississippi River to the Gulf, and they continue to eye each other carefully. They both understand that the river is a lifeline, but it's also a threat, right? Because whoever gets control of that Mississippi River controls the interior. And this rivalry dates back a decade before any shots are ever fired at Lexington. When the revolution does take off in the West, the struggle is already there. The Revolutionary War just offers to ignite it in a new way. The war then, when it comes to the Mississippi River Valley, is not so simple as colonists versus British overlords. You have to add in the Spanish, and we have this looming imperial rivalry on the war's western theater, but then also consider these indigenous powers that sit in between, often playing the Spanish and British off one another, and now faced with a new conundrum: what to do with the American rebels, what the French, Spanish, and Indians in the Illinois country refer to as the Bostones, right? Because that's where the trouble started in the East. So where to fit the Americans into this already delicate game of alliance building and rivalry in the Illinois country and Mississippi River Valley? When war breaks out in 1775, Native nations have to confront that question, right? How do you survive a war that is potentially going to become a war between empires, but also a war between nominal brothers or cousins, as native parlance describes it, right? The British and their American colonists. One that will certainly pull your homelands into it. Various native groups, we don't have time to go into all the different options, right, that they consider in the early years of the war, but various native groups respond in different ways all across the backcountry. The Iroquois Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee, famously fractures into what you might call a native civil war. The Cherokee divide internally, at least politically, during the war. Shawnees, Delawares, Miamis, and others in the Ohio country try to maintain neutrality in the early days of the war, weighing British promises against the threat of American expansion. The British continue to fortify sites like Detroit. Fort Pitt becomes the only American garrison in the West where there's a continental presence. And as the war progresses in the East, it follows suit in the West. Raids intensify between indigenous groups in the backcountry and settlers in the backcountry, right? There are villages that are burnt, women and children captured and killed on both sides. It's quite a bloody contest, right? And this theater of the war radicalizes the revolution in a way, brutalizes the revolution in a new way as native combatants get involved, and it racializes the conflict in ways that don't happen further east. It also becomes, in some ways, a civil war. If you would define a civil war as neighbor against neighbor, you know, some of these Delaware villages are several miles upriver from a Kentucky settlement or a British trading post or whatnot. So you literally do have neighbors breaking ranks and fighting one another. As Michael referenced, that's part of the book project that I'm working on now, is kind of looking at how these alliances break down in different ways over the course of the war. We don't have time to get into the particulars of those individuals tonight, but they are fascinating renegades that opt to side with native people over sometimes their frontier relatives and neighbors, right? So all of this transforms the Western theater into a bloodbath, from the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes down towards the Mississippi. We're not quite to the Mississippi theater yet of the war, because Spain remains neutral, at least in the early years. So we have to take into account all of these moving pieces before and after the shots fired on Lexington Green, right? And the British have to consider their options in the West as well. We've got British strategy, we've got Native American strategy, and we've got Spanish calculations, right? And as I've already outlined here, the view from Indian country is bleak as Native people debate who to side with, how to resist, how involved to get in this squabble between Europeans and American settlers. They all begin to converge on the Illinois country and Mississippi Valley in these unexpected ways. The Americans will launch their raids from Pittsburgh. As I mentioned earlier, Pittsburgh is the precarious toehold of the continental Americans in the West. This is the only place where the Continental Congress maintains any troops beyond the mountains during the war. It is also, right, the only place where they have an official Indian agency, as in they've got Continental Congress representatives going back and forth with the various native representatives of the Great Lakes and Ohio country. It is not surprising then that it will be the launching point for the most ambitious American plans for the West during the war. One of Pittsburgh's most prominent traders and an Indian commissioner for the Continental Congress, George Morgan, proposes a daring plan to use Pittsburgh as the starting point of a multi-riverine attack against British West Florida. In his plan of 1777, he offers that the Continental Congress should outfit an expedition down the Mississippi River from Fort Pitt to, quote, liberate all the British territory east of the river. George Morgan is convinced that the backcountry settlers on the British bank of the river would be eager to join the American cause if the British garrisons were removed from the region. Even before independence, we could say then, American leaders are thinking continentally. We see it in the plans of George Morgan by 1777, but this is a constant gaze west for the Americans, right? By 1775, you could argue that Congress has already allocated for the option of Western states to be added into the rebellion. The Articles of Association that lead to the Confederation era are amended to allow Canada or West Florida to join the Union as a participant if so willing. And of course, the campaigns north that we won't spend time on here against Canada reveal that kind of northern edge of the ambition, but this proposal for the southern approach, right, the western approach to the Mississippi Valley, reveal that the United States is already thinking about how to expand into the interior and how to expand the war continentally. This is geopolitical imagination, and it runs along the river routes that these fur traders and western settlers are thinking about. So in this way, we could frame the western theater of the war as a war over the waters of the West, a war of freshwater control. We see this even in the debates in Congress as they weigh George Morgan's proposal in 1777. Samuel Adams approves of it, right? Even though he's a Boston guy himself, he thinks it makes sense to expand the war into the Mississippi Valley. He declares that nature designs we should have it. General Benedict Arnold, late returned from the disastrous Quebec campaign, reads George Morgan's proposal, and as a military man weighs in saying that, quote, it seems an object of importance, not only as an acquisition of territory, but also as a means to open a door for a very considerable and lucrative trade with the Spaniards and Indians who could be our allies there. These most ambitious of Western designs would find encouragement and a willing leader for the raid in the fall of 77 with the arrival of James Willing, late from Natchez on the Mississippi, who had returned home to Pennsylvania. Willing, not pictured here, sorry, we don't have a picture of him, but he had been born in Philadelphia, and he was of Philadelphian extraction and network. He had journeyed to Natchez before the war to seek his fortune, but had returned north to his well-connected family by 1777 empty-handed. Willing recognized, however, that in George Morgan's plan there was a chance to serve his revolutionary government and also a chance to redeem his fortunes in the lower Mississippi. Through his older brother Thomas, who we do have a picture of, right, and Robert Morris, a business associate and member of Congress, James Willing secured a number of meetings with the Commerce Committee of the Continental Congress. Over the course of the fall, congressmen including William Smith of Maryland, Robert Morris of Pennsylvania, they met with Willing to discuss his ambitions for a continental expedition down the Mississippi. And after a series of discreet meetings, without the full knowledge or approval of Congress, Morris and Smith commissioned James Willing into the fledgling U.S. Navy as a captain. They gave him a commission and sent him west to Fort Pitt. He also carried instructions for the Continental General Edward Hand there to aid in the expedition's recruitment and outfitting from the frontier post. Notice they don't commission him into the army, right? They are thinking about water, even in the interior. They are thinking about the Ohio and Mississippi rivers as veins of an expanding freshwater empire. George Morgan, who is at Fort Pitt at the time, sees him off that fall when they purchase a interestingly named gunboat in the winter of 1778 called the Rattletrap. So they outfit this. There's a historian's sketch of what this would have looked like. 2 swivel guns on it, 10 oars to a side. This would have held maybe 20 or 30 men, okay? James Willing is the captain in command of this makeshift privateer on fresh water. And his mission is to descend the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, disrupt British authority in those parts, seize Loyalist property when possible, and open trade with Spanish New Orleans in the process. The expedition descends more than 1,000 river miles. Willing captures plantations along the way. He paroles the residents of Natchez, a previous British post. He seizes ships at Manchac, close to New Orleans. He paroles residents. He captures and resells enslaved people along the way. And he throws, as one New Orleans merchant puts it, the whole river into confusion. This is a rogue adventure with some strategic thinking behind it. Feeling out the defenses of British West Florida and imagining a continental expansion going forward. They reach New Orleans eventually, where they muff up the diplomacy with the Spanish, who at that point were still not in the war, but candidly supporting the Americans in places like the Illinois country and the lower Mississippi. They essentially behave as privateers in town, selling their prizes as a privateer would in open water, right? And destabilizing, in general, British West Florida. Now, James Willing is not the best man for the job because he's happy once he gets to New Orleans to sit there and rake in his prize money and not do much else, right? And so the British are able to recapture much of the west bank of Mississippi. They refortify places like Natchez. And so that strategic momentum that he had coming downriver doesn't get us very far. But it's the idea that counts here, right? The idea that the Americans have the capability, when inclined, to launch long-distance freshwater raids all the way into the lower Mississippi and the Gulf Coast. And of course, the more successful and the longer-lasting expedition that we probably know more about comes in the Illinois country under these same auspices. So this is led by George Rogers Clark, who coordinates with Spanish officials in St. Louis to pull off his successful conquest of the Illinois country, right? And as you can see on the map there, I've marked out St. Louis sits really directly across the river from one of George Rogers Clark's main objectives in the Illinois campaign of 1778. He leads a force of Kentuckians supplied by Virginia into Illinois. He captures the British garrison and governor at Kaskaskia. He then seizes Vincennes and Cahokia. Of course, daring frontier exploits, but also strategic, right? The Illinois country is the gateway to the Great Lakes and Spanish St. Louis, right? He preempts native alliances there in the Illinois country. He even gains some powerful people. Can't quite see it on this map, but if you go far enough up the Illinois River there, right, there is the very strategic Chicago Portage. This is the canoe carrier that gets you into the Great Lakes. George Rogers Clark picks a lot of fights with Indians in the Illinois country. He knows not to pick a fight with the people controlling that portage up there. So he befriends and even allies with a man named Siganok, who leads the Potawatomi villages there, and he secures a back door into the Great Lakes that scares the heck out of the British in Michilimackinac and Detroit. Even though George Rogers Clark is never able to act on that back door, it's there and it's looming, and it keeps the British garrison commanders up at night contemplating this potential joint invasion of Spanish Potawatomis and Virginians coming up through Lake Michigan, right? He, of course, secures the Illinois country for the Americans. He eventually captures Henry Hamilton, the British commander of Detroit, even though he doesn't get all the way to Detroit. And then finally, right, Spain does indeed join the war. Not as an American ally, though, right? They join as what we would call a co-belligerent, okay? And this is key, right, because it's not the way the French do it. The Spanish are worried about their own colonial holdings in the Americas. They're worried about the precedent that it would set if they side with a revolutionary republic in the New World, and therefore they just declare war on the British. They do not directly ally with the Americans. But they used that initiative in 1779 to launch new campaigns against British West Florida. They win the stunning victory at Pensacola. And Texas beef, right, as hopefully future speakers will talk about, are able, Texas beef supplies the Spanish campaigns in the Floridas and up the Mississippi, right? It is Texas beef and Texas produce that works its way all the way up to St. Louis to actually feed, in some cases, Clark's troops in the Illinois country, because there is a lot of clandestine support coming from the Spanish in St. Louis. So Spain declares war on the British and seizes important parts of Florida and the lower Mississippi as part of that. Governor Bernardo de Galvez is the decisive actor in all of this, of course, capturing Baton Rouge and Mobile before going on to Florida, and really setting up Spain for a pretty positive place at the treaty table at the end of the conflict. The British do push back, though, right? This is something that we don't talk about if we just focus on the lower Mississippi. Throughout 1779, 80, and 81, there are raids and counter-raids across the Illinois country between the British posts in the Great Lakes and the northern frontera of Spanish Louisiana there. In 1780, the largest of these offensive happens when the British launch a major campaign down the Mississippi from northern Illinois against St. Louis. It's a multi-day skirmish battle outside of St. Louis that becomes the most western battle of the entire war on the continent. The Spanish and their indigenous allies in St. Louis repel this joint expedition of British militia, fur traders, Dakota warriors, and some reluctant Anishinaabe that have been drug along from the Great Lakes. They turn around and flee back to Lake Michigan and Michilimackinac after several days of fighting, right? In response to that, the Spanish launched their own bold mission, a joint expedition between those Chicago area Anishinaabe Potawatomis and the Spanish militia. They strike north along the frozen Illinois River in 1781, and they capture briefly Fort St. Joseph on Lake Michigan's eastern shoreline. This is the furthest north that the Spanish Empire ever reaches. You might think of it as a high watermark for Bourbon Spain in North America, even though the Spanish flag only flies over this British fort for about 24 hours before they turn around and fall back to St. Louis, right? It is a brief Spanish incursion into the region that remains under the tenuous control of the British and will soon be claimed by the Americans at the treaty table. As we know, peace is hammered out, right, between the European powers and the American Republic in Paris in 1783. I love this painting because the British diplomats refused to sit long enough for it. They are so miffed at the loss of America. But it is concerns over Spanish ambitions in places like Fort St. Joseph and the Mississippi River Valley that push the Americans to broker a separate, more favorable peace with the British. This is a detail we usually forget about when we talk about the end of the war, right? They cut out their allies of France and their co-belligerent of Spain from the initial treaty sessions. And the British and the Americans decide to sit down together without the Spanish and French input. Essentially, Franklin, Adams, and John Jay are concerned that Spain may try to draw the border of American territory at the Appalachian Mountains, cutting them off from all of those western waters that they prize, rather than the Mississippi River. Spain would very much have liked this, right? Since it would have provided an even stronger native buffer zone between their own Louisiana possessions and American expansion. But the Americans get their favorable terms from the British, ironically, and Spain is faced with yet another borderland rivalry in the aftermath of the war, this time the Americans. But the war, of course, is not concluded peacefully in the West, right? The Treaty of Paris totally ignores native allies. Britain cedes lands it does not fully control in places like Ohio and the Illinois country, and the United States tries to assert sovereignty over these places against well-armed and still determined native nations there. So the violence will continue in the West long after 1783. You have indigenous confederacies formed to hold back the tide of American settlement, and the Americans will lose several armies in campaigning against the native constituents in the Ohio country and Great Lakes region during the 1780s and early 90s. And even the fate of white Americans, right? So unsettled West is the theme, right? But that's true even for white Americans beyond the mountains who remain uncertain in the decades after the American Revolution. Uncertain about their loyalty to the United States and uncertainty about whether the United States can exert control and protection over its western lands. The West is still in chaos in the 80s and 90s. The British are still a presence in the West, even though one of the stipulations of the treaty is that they have to withdraw from their posts in the Great Lakes. They don't, right? British garrisons still guard Detroit, Niagara, Michilimackinac, and several other smaller garrisons. They continue to supply native resistance efforts in the Ohio country with arms, ammunition, and guidance through their Indian department into the 1790s. And so white Americans in places like Kentucky and southern Ohio and parts of what will become Tennessee have to consider their options after the war. There is this small temptation to return to the British fold, right? The Indian raids will stop if Kentucky somehow becomes loyal. The independent Republic of Vermont briefly considers joining the British in Canada after the Revolutionary War, and there are some late loyalists, even in places like Lexington, Kentucky, that consider this as an option. One of the more outlandish options that Westerners consider in this same era is to support revolutionary France. George Rogers Clark writes a letter and enters secret negotiations with French agents, offering to raise an army of Kentuckians to secure the region for France, and then march on New Orleans, capture Spanish Louisiana in the process, and restore French presence and empire in North America. It's only after the plot is exposed and George Rogers Clark is embarrassed and condemned by both Americans and Spanish that this possibility fades from reality. And of course, the most obvious alternative empire that Westerners could turn to are the Spanish themselves. After the American Revolution, Spain had closed access to the Mississippi River to American trade. And American settlers in the West, if they want to sell their goods downriver, must swear oaths of loyalty to the Spanish crown. They also, in some cases, must nominally convert to Catholicism in order to secure lands on the west side of the river. And many Westerners do it, right? James Wilkinson who you see pictured over there, is the most famous trader. He works as a double agent for the Spanish during this era. He's the second highest ranking general in the U.S. Army at the time. Always good. But also people like Daniel Boone, right? Take oaths of allegiance. Daniel Boone will end his days not as an American citizen, but as a Spanish subject in Missouri before the Americans purchase the Louisiana Territory. This is why all this uncertainty, all of this mixed loyalty, is why by 1794, the Americans, who are on the verge of securing control over the Ohio country and points west, are still uncertain of their prospects controlling the region. The U.S. commander of the American forces facing off against the Native Confederation in Ohio, General Mad Anthony Wayne, as he's called, is convinced that the Americans face not just a confederation of indigenous people, but what he calls a conspiracy of interests in the West. For Wayne, and in reality, this is still not just a story of American frontiersmen against native resistance. British and Spanish intrigues are very real, and they are heavy on Wayne's mind when he marches west in 1794. We see this in a letter he writes back to Henry Knox, the Secretary of War, a month before his victory at Fallen Timbers. He says that, quote, the British have used, and I should say there's some offensive terminology in here. That is the parlance of the day as far as Wayne goes, right? So bear with me. The British have used every possible exertion to collect the savages from the most distant nations with the most solemn promises of advancing and cooperating with them against the Legion. Nor have the Spanish been idle upon this occasion. It is therefore more than probable that the day is not far distant when we shall meet this Hydra, and he underlines it in his letter, in the vicinity of the Grand Glades and the Roche de Boot, without being able to discriminate between the white and the red savages. In Wayne's mind, the West is still a story of American conquest against the Spanish Empire, the British, and native groups, right? This is a complicated international zone. This is not cowboys versus Indians. If we are to understand the long, complex history of the American Revolution along its western borderlands, this is the way to conceptualize it. A many-headed hydra of competing interests, shifting loyalties, and entangled indigenous and European empires, squaring off against Western American settlers and their Eastern backers. It is a history of contingency rather than inevitability, and it shows just how long the fate of the West remained unsettled in the long war of independence west of the mountains. Of course, Wayne does win the battle at Fallen Timbers. He does not face Spanish or British, but merely the Western Confederation of indigenous warriors. And so American forces succeed in consolidating that power after 1794. This means that we forget about this complicated history. We no longer contemplate just how unsure American conquest beyond the mountains remained until about 1794. In that year, Wayne wins his victory at Fallen Timbers. The next year, the Greenville Treaty secures indigenous peace and territory in the Ohio country, along with other access points to the Northwest Territory. American success comes rapidly from there. The British quickly negotiate a new treaty with John Jay over the Great Lakes. They give up their forts there, and they open the region to commerce with British Canada. Spain, too, quickly comes to terms with the Americans over the Mississippi, reopening trade there. Pinckney's treaty establishes the boundaries of Spanish and U.S. claims in the southeast and lower Mississippi River. So by 1796, we might say, the long Revolutionary War of the West is finally over. Spain remains in control of lower Louisiana and Texas. Spanish officials know the threat has changed. It's no longer the British that keep them up at night, it's the Americans, right? The United States continues to expand. So the impulses of geography that shaped the Revolutionary War for the West will continue to shape U.S. policy towards its imperial rivals and native neighbors for decades to come. The same river networks that carried Willing south and Clark west will carry migrants, traders, and speculators towards the Spanish borderlands in the decades after the 1790s. The revolution has not secured Texas for Spain nor Louisiana. It has set in motion forces that will eventually reach those places. And the struggle for the American interior is far from over. But we can trace it to its revolutionary origins, right? The contours of Western orientation that begin before the war ever starts and carry on long afterwards. If we return to that opening map as we conclude, the one drawn along rivers rather than coastlines, the revolution appears transformed. We see a civil war within Native America, a contest that started not just with Americans and British overlords, but between empires, the British and the Spanish. Freshwater campaigns for continental leverage, a proving ground for American ambition in freshwater zones, and a war that redrew imperial geographies and not just those of a new American republic. The revolution in the West then is not just a sideshow, it's not peripheral, it is continental, it is international, it is about sovereignty not just for the United States, but for dozens of native nations and 2 European empires still holding on. It looks much less like a colonial rebellion, and it looks much more like that great war for empire that colonists talked about during the French and Indian era. The republic that emerged in 1783 was already continental in ambition, already shaped by its riverine geography and its westward orientation. It remained entangled with empires and native groups from the very beginning. Because along the Ohio, the Illinois, the Mississippi, the future of the United States was imagined, contested, and born along the riverways. Thank you so much for tuning in today. My name is John William Nelson, again, as you'll see up there. My first book talks a bit about the Great Lakes Theater and the Illinois country, Chicago specifically, with parts about the Revolution. I'm at Texas Tech if you ever want to find me, just up the Caprock. And my information, you can feel free to take a screenshot there as we head towards questions. I will be happy to answer any, and I hopefully haven't talked you to death yet. So thank you again for hosting me. It's been a pleasure.